Welcome back to Unit 2 of Transforming Classroom Grading Practices in conjunction with Eastern Washington University and Excel Education Resources. In Unit 1, we talked about why do we grade. In Unit 2, we will focus on what do we grade. So, here we go. In Unit 2, what do we grade? We will have 4 modules. Module 1, we talk about multi-tiered systems of support to ensure effective Tier 1 instruction. Module 2 is taking a tour of key learning targets. And Module 3, the role of proficiency scales and success criteria that go along with each of those learning targets. And in Module 4, we talk about the roles of Tiers 2 and 3 in a multi-tiered systems of support in terms of grading targets and standards. In Module 1, multi-tiered systems of support, we reference back to this graphic, which many of you may have seen before. In this graphic, what we see is that Tier 1 is where we have effective core instruction. What the graphic is saying is that if that instruction is effective, 80% of our students should be able to meet standard. 20% of the students, however, may need additional support. I want to just reemphasize that means additional support in addition to the Tier 1. For more information about multi-tiered systems of support, please reference McIntosh and Goodman's book, Integrated Multi-Tiered Systems of Support, Blending RTI and PBIS. The point here is, in what do we grade, we need to have a focus on effective Tier 1 instruction and what it entails. This is a different graphic around multi-tiered systems of support, which I actually prefer, because in the previous graphic, people often misrepresent it and say that only 80% of students should be in Tier 1. No, once again, what the graphic is saying is with effective Tier 1 instruction, 80% of students should be able to meet Level 3 proficiency. So in this graphic, it's saying and making very clear, all students get Tier 1 first, and then some students will get additional support, and a few students will get intensified support. Again, I know we're talking about grading, and you may wonder why we're talking about multi-tiered systems of support, but the bottom line of it is that effective Tier 1 instruction is what guides the what of our grading systems. Marzano provides indicators of high reliability schools, including the following descriptors of a guaranteed and viable curriculum. The school curriculum and accompanying assessments adhere to state and district standards. The school curriculum is focused enough that teachers can adequately address it in the time they have available. And all students have the opportunity to learn the critical content of the curriculum. Again, referencing these indicators for a guaranteed and viable curriculum address the requirements for effective Tier 1 instruction, and therefore the foundations of what we grade. In a moment, pause this presentation and, using your reflections worksheet, ponder the following questions. What is the purpose for multi-tiered systems of support in schools? What are the implications of effective Tier 1 instruction for all students? Further, what do your instructional frameworks say about the role of standards-based learning targets in effective instruction? Okay, so as we begin to address Module 2, we're going to look at standards-based targets, which are the foundation of effective Tier 1 instruction. We're going to take a round-the-world tour. And as we do so, we'll be considering the question, if criterion reference grading is the most appropriate purpose for grading, then what is our criteria? Again, what is our criteria for effective Tier 1 instruction? How do effective criterion reference grading practices implicate our knowledge and implementation of state and national standards? We begin with a look at what should we grade in K2 regarding ELA targets. Here we're looking at Common Core ELA targets, in which they lay out the reading foundations of phonology, or the study of the sounds in language, orthography, in which we apply those sounds to letters and words, and morphology, in which we actually study those words and word parts. These Common Core K2 Reading Foundations learning targets are also embedded in a scale where level 1 says that an attempt was made, but there was little evidence for proficiency. Level 2, there's some partial evidence towards proficiency. But level 3 is very clearly spelled out as to what it means to be proficient in phonology, orthography, and morphology in K2. And those criteria for being proficient are actually written in this case in I can language. And level 4 is where the student can demonstrate more in-depth inferences. Now, what's wonderful about what we should grade in English language arts in grades 3 through high school is that our learning targets do not change. In fact, here they all are on one page. And even though the learning targets don't change from 3rd to high school, what does change is the text complexity students are required to read or the genre. You will notice that in claim of reading, there's both literary text and informational text, and the learning targets are quite similar. And then we see the writing targets, the speaking and listening target, as well as the research and inquiry targets, in which students are required to interpret and integrate information, analyze information and sources, and use evidence. Reading for informational text and the research learning targets really implicate other content areas such as social studies and science. Although the reading for informational text is pertinent for each and every content area that requires a student to be able to read any sort of text. So we could pretty much make the argument that reading for informational text belongs to each and every teacher at each and every grade. But the point is, what should we grade? In 3rd grade through high school, these are the learning targets for English language arts. What should we grade in math? This slide shows us the K-12 math domains, the sort of bigger areas that cover mathematics. In particular, I want you to notice what is unique about kindergarten. Which grade band is responsible for fractions? Which math domain is the only one that goes all the way from kinder through high school? And I'd like you for a moment just to focus in on grade 6 and take a look at the math domains that are covered in grade 6. Geometry, ratios and proportional relationships, number system, expressions and equations, statistics and probability. Now, underneath each of these math domains lies math targets. Again, what should we grade? So in this case, I asked you to look at grade 6, and here we see those same math domains, and then we can see that underneath each math domain, there are specific learning targets. In ratios and proportional relationships, there's only one target, in which by the end of 6th grade mathematics, students should be able to understand ratio concepts and use ratio reasoning to solve problems. We are going to come back to this website over and over again and give you time to also explore and be at recess and mess around with this website. It's in smarterbalance.org, and it is called the Content Explorer. And I've put the URL address at the bottom of this slide. In science, what should we grade? The next gen science standards are clearly outlined, and I'm showing something that has a lot of stuff on this page, but this is the NGSS, or Next Generation Science Disciplinary Core Ideas, in which it lays out all of the different learning targets for each topic arrangement. We're going to talk more about science as we go through this unit. Yes, there are social studies learning targets. If you don't have any specific to your state, please feel free to visit the National Social Studies Teachers website, in which you will find the social studies learning targets for each and every grade level. A lot of times I've heard teachers say, we don't have time to teach social studies. We've got to make sure our students can read. However, in a vibrant democracy, social studies is a content area that we need to give a lot of attention to. And in fact, it is a really great way to teach reading and writing. The arts also have standards. What should we grade in the arts? Well, the different art disciplines are dance, media arts, music, theater, visual arts. And then within each of those arts disciplines are the standards in which we're looking at what should we grade? It should be around how students are creating, how students are performing or producing, how are they responding to the arts, and are they making connections? Health and fitness also has key learning targets. Again, look at your state to see what your state's learning targets are for health and fitness. If your state does not have any, please visit National PE Standards. Shape America sets the standard. World languages also have key learning targets focused around culture, communities, connections, and comparisons. Of course, we can't forget career and technical education. What should we grade in CTE? Well, it turns out, and all CTE teachers know this, they have their own content area standards, but every one of those standards is required to also meld together with the Common Core reading and writing standards and math standards. Additionally, CTE has a standard around leadership. So these are the key things that should be graded in CTE. So we've just taken a round the world tour of many different content areas and talking about what should we grade in effective Tier 1 core instruction. So again, using your reflections worksheet, ponder the following questions. What do your instructional frameworks say about standards-based learning targets or instructional outcomes? If criterion reference grading is the most appropriate purpose for grading, what is your criteria? What are the key standards-based learning targets for your classroom? How are the key standards-based learning targets for your classroom reflected in your actual grading practices? Is the relationship and the reflection between the two accurate and clear? Or is it a little blurry and fuzzy? Most important, do your students know the key standards-based learning targets for your classroom? In Module 2, we talked about the key learning targets required for effective Tier 1 instruction. Underneath each one of those targets lies a proficiency scale, as well as success criteria, which defines proficiency at level 3. In the new Art and Science of Classroom Assessment, Marzano states, with a series of scores on a proficiency scale as opposed to a 100-point scale, a teacher can more accurately estimate a summative score using antecedent formative scores. This is because we can reference a score on a proficiency scale to a continuum of knowledge, regardless of the test format. A score of 3.0 on a test means that the student has demonstrated competence regardless of the type of test. Now, there's a lot of fancy words in this quote from his book of 2019. But basically what it is saying is a grade and the proficiency and the success criteria is all about the definition, the specific definition of what it means to be proficient for a specific target. And it is not about whether or not this was homework or a test or a project. It's that it's again, criterion referenced. What is the success criteria for level 3 on a proficiency scale around a specific learning target? In formative assessment, making it happen in the classroom, Margaret Heritage states that the learning goal identifies what the students will learn during the course of a lesson or lessons, or a unit. The success criteria identify what it takes to meet that learning goal and is used as checks on learning. Before the lesson or lessons or unit even begins, these goals and success criteria are shared with the student. Success criteria are the guide to learning while the student is engaged in the learning tasks over that particular period of time. Additionally, shared learning targets that are clear, specific, and tied to exemplars of excellence increase the possibility for success for educators and their students. Have our students been given clear exemplars of excellence to provide clarity around success criteria and the clear expectations for what they need to provide evidence for level 3 proficiency? Proficiency scales and success criteria, which communicate level 3 proficiency, guide not only the teacher's instructional decisions, it also guides the student's intrinsic personal learning journey. Remember in Unit 1, all that discussion we had around students being motivated and knowing what their learning journey is and having a growth mindset and not being in a neural downshift? This is where the clear criteria and the clear journey helps a student feel motivated and they don't withdraw from the learning experience. Where do proficiency scales and success criteria show up in your instructional or leadership frameworks? Okay, we are going to get into the weeds here a little bit, and we're going to be talking about different types of proficiency scales. All of these are proficiency scales. They just all have a little bit of a different purpose. So the first proficiency scale we're going to be looking at undergirds the Common Core standards, and it is called the Depth of Knowledge, or DOK. On the left-hand side, you'll see the DOK wheel, which has been used many times in many schools. And in fact, in some schools, teachers have students put this in the front of their notebook so they know that what they're working towards is level 3. And just being able to have students know the language of level 3 and level 4 is really helpful, as we'll talk about when we talk about the role of vocabulary in level 2 descriptors. But it's probably more accurate to look at the right side of this slide so that we can see that the depth of knowledge one is more around recall and reproduction, whereas when we get to DOK3 and strategic thinking, that is where we begin to see and define proficiency. All of the Common Core standards have a foundation and lie on top of a proficiency scale, the DOK. Now, another form of proficiency scale in Smarter Balanced is called the Achievement Level Descriptors, or ALDs. This is where we become very, very specific and actually give examples of evidence of what students know and can do that provides proficiency evidence. In this case, this comes from the Smarter Balance item specs, and we're going to actually go back to the Smarter Balance Content Explorer and find out where all of this information is. But in this case, we are looking again at middle school number system and functions, these two domains. So in 6th grade, there are 3 targets in the domain of number systems. There are 2 targets at 7th grade in the domain of number systems and 1 target in the domain of number systems for 8th grade. Underneath each one of these targets is a construct relevant vocabulary the student needs in order to be able to engage at a proficient level. Again, these are all found in the Content Explorer, and you're going to be given time to mess around in that wonderful resource. And on this slide, what I've done is given the level 3 descriptor. Very specific. It captures the depth of knowledge, but goes even deeper to give you the achievement level descriptor specific to this target. So the DOK is a little more general. Achievement level descriptors much more defined and specific, but they play really well together. A potential easier way to look at these learning targets and proficiency scales is through another resource through Smarter Balance called the Connections Playlists. Now, originally, these Connections Playlists are to be used with the interim assessment blocks for Smarter Balance. But even if you don't give the interim assessment blocks, these can be really great resources that you can even use with students. So in these connections playlists, this happens to be grades 3, 4, and 5, the domain of fractions. And at the top of each one of these playlists, you will see the specific learning target. And then let's say that you give students a pre-assessment prior to the fractions unit in this case, and students are below standard. This gives you a lot of detail about what those students need in terms of instruction and to build up their skills and their knowledge to move them up to the next level of being at or near standard. Now, it might be that some students give a pre-assessment and they're already above standard. Again, these playlists can give you a guide into how you would give those students who are above standard an opportunity to go further with their understanding and their application. These connections playlists can also be utilized for vertical teaming. Let's say that you want to go beyond just looking at your own, what do I grade in my classroom, but maybe you as a team or even as a grade band team want to look at, well, how are we grading fractions from 3rd through 5th grade? You could use these in vertical teaming to get clear about what do we grade when it comes to fractions. Here's a learning target, here's the proficiency scale, and how can you make sure students are clear about what these all mean and what might be some examples. We'll be talking more about that in the rest of this unit and especially in Unit 3 and 4. Now, the Next Gen Science Standards, we talked about the DCI document in Module 2. And at the bottom of each one of the topic arrangements, you will see that they have linked the NGSS, the science standards, to the ELA and math Common Core targets. So 5th grade physical science, matter and its interactions, weaves together, as you can see by the first orange arrow, reading for informational text. Remember that learning target? It also shows the math targets that go with this particular science unit, which includes numbers in base 10 and fractions and measurement and data. The Next Gen Science evidence statements provide a proficiency scale. So here we can see the learning target at the top, and then below it, we're able to see a level 1, a level 2, and a level 3, in which it begins to give us an idea of where it is we want students to be able to go to actually use their reasoning and be at level 3. Again, Next Gen Science evidence statements are available for every grade level, kindergarten through high school. This is an example of a generic science proficiency scale in which what is communicated is basically understanding the scientific method and in general the scientific concepts. The blanks is where you would insert whatever the topic might be, whether it's genetics or whether it's Earth and space. English language proficiency assessments also provide guides for learning targets and proficiency scales. This happens to be an example of ELPA 21. And you can see the learning targets for reading and for writing. This happens to be for the grade band 6 through 8. And the proficiency scales moving from level 1 beginning to level 2 early intermediate, all the way to level 4 and 5, which are early advanced and advanced. Again, how might we share these learning targets and proficiency scales with our learners as we establish what do we grade in effective Tier 1 instruction? One of my big learnings this last couple of years has been the importance of making sure that key vocabulary is essential for level 2 descriptors in a proficiency scale. These just happen to be some math vocab cards I created where at the top, this is fractions. At the top of the card, I have the learning target for third, fourth, and the 2 fifth grade fractions targets. At the bottom, I've given the level 3 descriptor. And then in the middle, I've laid out that construct relevant vocab that you saw in that previous complicated chart. But again, if we want students to reach level 3 and be proficient, we need to make sure that they are really have their vocabulary, that key construct relevant vocabulary under their belts at level 2. A note about level 4 descriptors. As you begin to take a look at the achievement level descriptors and start to play around with the Content Explorer and Smarter Balanced, really take a careful look at the level 4 descriptors, which often use the verbs create, use, and apply. Sometimes I go into schools and I will see a scale on the wall, and level 4 says, I can teach it to someone else. Level 4 is much more than I can teach this to someone else. Level 4 means that you can take the level 3 proficiency descriptor to a new and novel real-world scenario. Now, one thing to think about is, and we'll get more into this later, but how might we allow students to choose their level 4 evidence? This slide is just a way to sort of summarize what we've talked about in modules 2 and 3 to make sure we understand proficiency scales, the role of achievement level descriptors, learning progressions, and rubrics. So, proficiency scales are used to determine a student's current level of progress toward a target or standard or a set of targets in a unit of study, where level 3 describes proficiency or the success criteria. Achievement level descriptors are a type of proficiency scale, but they are very specific to a particular target and provide explicit examples of the student evidence at each one of the levels. Learning progressions describe students' progress over time across targets and incorporate the proficiency scale or achievement level descriptors to be able to describe and establish the student's learning journey or the learning progression. For example, the chart we were looking at on fractions, we could see what the progression would be from third to fourth to fifth, or in number systems at middle school, the progression from sixth to seventh to eighth. So learning progressions take us over time and use proficiency scales as well as the targets. And then rubrics are typically used for a single piece of work or a project, and thus are highly specific. For example, in this course, there are 2 rubrics, one for the end of Unit 1, your paper that you wrote on why do you grade, and there'll be one again for Unit 4 on how to establish your plan for transforming grading practices in your classroom. They're very specific to this course and those units. O'Connor tells us that the meaning of grades, letters or numbers, should come from clear descriptions of a limited number of levels. If students hit the goal, they get the grade. We've covered a lot of information in modules 2 and 3. Take a moment to reflect and write about maybe both those modules. What do your instructional frameworks say about learning targets and instructional outcomes, proficiency scales, success criteria? What is the role of the depth of knowledge and standards-based key learning targets? And what is the relationship among depth of knowledge, achievement level descriptors, proficiency scales, and success criteria? How is a proficiency scale different or similar to a rubric? And how does providing students with clear learning targets and proficiency scales support their learning and address the concepts outlined in Unit 1, Why Do We Grade? See you in a moment. We end Unit 2 on What Do We Grade by taking a moment to check in with the role of these targets and standards when we're thinking about tiers 2 and 3 in multi-tiered systems of support. Hopefully, we've established that targets and proficiency scales are critical for identifying and establishing effective Tier 1 instruction that each and every learner receives. And if they're struggling and they need additional support, that the additional support they receive will support what is happening in Tier 1. Here's an example that hopefully will be helpful. You go to visit your doctor for your annual physical, and you are measured for your height and your weight, blood pressure, pulse. They listen to your heart and lungs. They look for signs of skin cancer, check your reflexes, and probably also do some testing on your blood and your urine. Before we even ponder tiers 2 and 3 here for a moment, what if the doctor says, oh yeah, you're good, gives you a note, says you're a C? Would it be very helpful? But if you really wanted to improve your health, what information might you need that was more specific? But let's say that you've been to your annual physical, doctor says you're all good to go, and you're on your way. But what if some things show ominous signs? What if your blood pressure is high or there's something funny with your urine? What do they do next? They don't just give you a C or a C minus or a D and send you on your way. They're going to dig deeper. They're going to say, what additional diagnostic assessment is needed? Is it salt? Is it not enough exercise? Is it the kidneys? They're going to wonder, what additional support do you need to get your Tier 1 targets back under control? This is a purpose of additional support in Tier 2 and 3. That additional support is there to help get the learner and get their Tier 1 targets back to normal. So how do these targets and proficiency scales help us with Tiers 2 and 3? So let's go back to our 6th grade example again with ratio and proportional relationships. Understand ratio concepts and use ratio reasoning to solve problems. Let's say the teacher gives a pre-assessment. There are ominous signs that a student or group of students do not understand this target. In the Smarter Bounds Content Explorer, you can go into the achievement level descriptors and determine, are these students at level 1 or level 2 because of this specific information. You might even find out that they're not even at level 1, and you might want to just start with vocabulary. Also, each one of the targets has underneath it very specific standards. You could take a look at each of these to diagnose and determine, where does the student have a lack of background knowledge? Again, a problem with vocabulary or some sort of conceptual misunderstanding. This is where Tiers 2 and 3 go deeper than just the learning target and dig into those specific standards to figure out, where is this student struggling? How do we get this student's Tier 1 targets back under control? So pause this presentation, take a moment to reflect and write. How should effective MTSS Tier 1 instruction for all students inform additional support in Tiers 1, 2, and 3? If students are struggling with Tier 1 learning targets, how might you use the detail of the achievement level descriptors and the standards to provide additional support or to differentiate instruction? What should be graded in classes focused on Tiers 2 and 3? Your Unit 2 assignment on what do we grade requires you to take a look at the unit planning template as one of your handouts. You can either use that unit planning template or create one of your own or find a different template that works for you. But what you're going to be doing is pondering your reflections worksheet, your literature review worksheet, your scenario handouts from Units 1 and 2. And using a unit planning template, you're going to focus on steps 1 through 4, in which you will assign clear standards-based learning targets and proficiency scales for at least 3 units of study pertinent to your personal classroom. It could be for PE, it could be for welding, it could be for the arts, it could be for 3rd grade fractions. Pick 3 units of study that you would really like to dig into and be able to transform your classroom grading practices. Here's an example of the unit planning template provided as one of your handouts. Again, what is the title of your unit? What are the standards-based learning targets for that unit? The time frame, because remember, with guaranteed and viable, you want to be able to have the time to teach those main targets. What is your level 3 descriptor and your success criteria for the end of unit learning target? And then from that level 3 proficiency descriptor, develop the full proficiency scale. What would be a level 1 in which there's little to no evidence? A level 2, partial evidence. Take note of these 4 steps for the end of Unit 2 assignment. Have fun, and I'll see you back here for Unit 3.